Donald Trump is coming back to the White House. Trump won the 2024 U.S. presidential election in a landslide, defeating his Democratic opponent Kamala Harris by 5 million votes. Unlike in 2016, where Donald Trump had only won the Electoral College, but he lost the popular vote, this time around, he won the popular vote by a big margin. So how did this happen? How did the Democrats and Kamala Harris get crushed so thoroughly? Today I'm going to be explaining why, and I'll discuss what a second Trump term will mean for the US and the economy. Now, I'm going to do a separate video explaining Trump's impact on foreign policy and on the world, on China, Russia, Israel, Iran. There are a lot of issues to address, but I want to keep this relatively shorter because I don't want to make this over an hour long. Today I want to focus on answering the question specifically, why did Kamala Harris lose so badly? To understand this, we need to go back to 2019 when Kamala Harris became a national figure in the US for the first time. She announced that she was going to run for president, and she was one of a dozen contenders in the Democratic primary. And in November 2019, a poll found that she had 1% support among the Democratic electorate. 1%. Harris was so unpopular that she actually withdrew from the race before the Democratic primary officially even began in 2020. And one of the main reasons is that Harris didn't really offer anything, and no one really knew where she stood politically. Because Kamala Harris had made her name in California as the Attorney General with a tough on crime agenda. She had proudly referred to herself as California's top cop. She threw poor parents in jail when their children didn't go to school. And yet, in 2019, in the lead up to the 2020 election, she suddenly portrayed herself as a progressive, going against her entire political career. Now, let's not forget the historical context here. In the 2016 and 2020 primaries in the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders was very popular. And in fact, in 2017, a poll found that Bernie Sanders was the single most popular politician in the United States. And of course, he was running on a very progressive agenda, but especially focusing on economic issues, challenging the billionaire oligarchs that dominate US politics. He wanted to get money out of politics. He wanted to serve working people in the country and not billionaire elites. He promised higher education would be free. He promised universal health care. So some other candidates in the Democratic Party were trying to steal some of that thunder and portray themselves as progressives, despite the fact that for many years they had been very right-wing Democrats. Kamala Harris is an example of this. She constantly flip-flopped, claiming that one day she was a progressive and the next day she was a tough on crime, top cop, conservative Democrat, and no one could trust her. Authenticity matters a lot in politics, and everyone could see clearly that Harris was a phony. There are so many interviews in which Kamala Harris is asked a question by a journalist and she refuses to answer the question. She responds with 50 words that sound like an answer, but if you actually listen to them, they mean nothing. She was the master of evasion, and no one felt they could trust her.
The work that we have done has resulted in a number of movements in that region by Israel that were very much prompted by or a result of many things, including our advocacy for what needs to happen in the region.
But the fact that Kamala Harris had no consistent ideology and really didn't believe in anything is also one of the reasons that the Democratic Party leadership loved her. Because the Democratic Party leadership, which is funded by big billionaires and big corporations, could use Kamala Harris as a symbol, as an empty vessel to try to win the election. That's why Joe Biden picked her in 2020 during his race, because he and the Democratic Party donor class knew that she would not rock the boat. Because even though Bernie Sanders was extremely popular with his left-wing economic proposals, in reality, the Democratic Party leadership is entirely accountable to the billionaire donor class. And the strategy of the Democrats for years now has been to continuously move further and further to the right to try to win over so-called moderate Republicans. This was spelled out very clearly by the Democratic Party leader and Senator Chuck Schumer of New York. He famously said, quote, "For every blue-collar Democrat we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we will pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs in Philadelphia," end quote. So this has been the Democratic Party strategy going back to Hillary Clinton's race in 2016, Biden's race in 2020, and Kamala's race in 2024. Kamala Harris ran a very right-wing campaign, even to the right of Joe Biden, and she was campaigning with the support of neoconservatives like Dick Cheney. Harris held campaign events with the former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, the daughter of Dick Cheney, and her slogan was country over party. She didn't actually present any tangible policies that people cared about. It was all this idea that we have a very big tent that brings together right-wing Republicans from the Bush administration with the Democrats.
And I also want to thank your father, Vice President Dick Cheney, for his support and what he has done to serve our country.
She thanked Dick Cheney, one of the architects of the Iraq War, for serving our country, as she put it. Dick Cheney was the vice president under George W. Bush of the Republican Party. 2 decades ago, he was the main enemy of the Democrats. They rightfully condemned and protested Cheney and Bush for invading Iraq, which caused 1 million Iraqi deaths. But in 2024, they were literally campaigning with the Cheney family. And let's not forget that Kamala Harris never had a Democratic mandate for her campaign for president. She had never run in a primary. There was no Democratic primary because it was assumed that Joe Biden would be the candidate as the incumbent president. But because of his very bad state of mental health, to put it euphemistically, Kamala Harris was anointed by the Democratic Party leadership, despite the fact that she was very unpopular with the American people. So even before she started campaigning, she did not have a lot of support. And then when Harris was given the nomination by the party to be their candidate, she ran a very right-wing campaign. She tried to out-Trump Trump on immigration, which is one of the most insane things you can think of. She insisted that the Democrats were going to be really tough on immigration and basically echoed similar rhetoric of Trump. Now, why would someone vote for a softer version of Trump when they can just vote for Trump? I mean, what is the point of this strategy? It makes no sense. This is exactly what Hillary Clinton and the Democratic leadership did during the 2016 race, when Clinton and Trump were the 2 least popular politicians in the United States, and Bernie Sanders was the most popular politician. But the billionaire donor class that fund the Democratic Party hated Bernie, of course. In fact, not only did the Democratic leadership not learn anything from their failure in 2016, they doubled down on the same failed strategy, and Hillary Clinton admitted that she was advising Kamala Harris in the 2024 election.
So what is your assessment of the stakes of this election? I mean, you are in a very exclusive club of people who've ever run for president, let alone run against Donald Trump. So to what extent do you offer counsel or do you speak with Kamala Harris about how to run against Donald Trump, who, as you've said, is a different candidate now, a darker candidate, arguably, than he was in 2016?
That's absolutely true, Willie. You know, I've talked with Kamala a few times. I obviously talked with her before the debate.
Hillary Clinton was the only person who had ever lost an election to Trump, and she was advising Kamala on how to beat Trump. So maybe it's no surprise that Kamala lost to Trump. But the reality is that structurally, the Democratic Party is not capable of learning that lesson because it is entirely dependent on donations from big corporations, from Wall Street, from billionaire oligarchs. And Kamala Harris spent half of her campaign trying to woo those oligarchs on Wall Street. So basically, the Democrats spent the entire campaign spitting in the face of their own base, telling their own voters, screw you. We're not going to give you anything. You don't deserve anything. We're going to try to win over the Republicans. Because the view of the Democrats is we don't have to give people on the left anything. They have to vote for us. They have no other option. So you know what actually happened? A lot of Democratic voters and left-wing voters simply stayed home. They did not participate. As Reuters noted, for the first time, the number of independents who voted in the 2024 election outnumbered the Democrats. 34% of voters in the 2024 election were self-declared independents, the highest number on record. That was tied with the Republicans at 34%. Democrats had the lowest turnout of just 32%. And even in major Democratic strongholds like Massachusetts, local media outlets noted that turnout was much lower because so few people were motivated to actually vote for Kamala Harris. Because think about it. What was Harris actually offering people? What were her concrete proposals? There were very few of them. She was very evasive in almost all of the interviews she did. She never clearly answered the question. And her entire campaign slogan was, "We're not Donald Trump." That's it. They're saying, vote for us because we're not the other guy. We're not going to offer you anything. We're not going to do anything for you. How are you going to motivate people to vote for you if you're not promising them anything? Donald Trump's promising people a lot. We know what Donald Trump's proposals are. High tariffs, build the wall, deport immigrants. A lot of these proposals are very crazy and extreme, but he's offering people something tangible. He's saying we're going to change the status quo, whereas the Democrats are saying we're not going to offer you anything. We're going to continue with the status quo because the status quo is good. This was the same strategy of the opponents of Brexit in the UK. They said everything's fine. We don't need to offer anyone anything. And what happened? They lost. The Brexiters won. Because they were offering people something, even though they were often full of BS, even though their promises were false, they were still offering something. And Trump, of course, has this reputation of being a political outsider and a populist. Now, today I'll explain why that's completely fraudulent. It's false. Donald Trump is also funded by many billionaire oligarchs on Wall Street. He cut taxes on the rich during his first term, which led to billionaires paying lower taxes than the working class. His policies hurt working people and helped the rich. But his populist rhetoric still motivated people to vote for him, whereas the Democrats did not motivate anyone. A good example of this is Michigan, a key swing state in the election. Now, Obama won Michigan and Biden won Michigan, but Kamala lost Michigan. It was Trump who won Michigan. And one of the reasons for this is because Kamala Harris spent her entire campaign alienating her voters, her base of support in Michigan, especially Arab American voters in major cities like Dearborn, which has a very large Arab population in Michigan. These are voters who had often voted Democrat, but in the 2024 race, many of them simply didn't vote, or some even voted third party, out of protest because Kamala Harris ignored them, spat in their face, and Kamala and the Democratic Party leadership did not listen to what their voters were telling them. Numerous polls showed, for instance, that 77% of Democrats said the U.S. should stop sending weapons to Israel. Only 23% of Democrats wanted to continue sending weapons to Israel. And yet, what was the response of Kamala and Biden and the Democrats? They said, we're going to continue sending weapons to Israel. We're going to continue supporting Israel in this horrific war in Gaza and Lebanon. And Israel has killed many Palestinians and Lebanese, including family members of Arab American voters in states like Michigan that Kamala Harris ended up losing. Because why would someone vote for Kamala Harris when she and Biden were killing their family members in Gaza and Lebanon? In fact, a poll published in August, just a few months before the election, showed that Kamala Harris could have easily won more support and Democratic voters in key swing states. All she had to do is promise that the U.S. would stop sending weapons to Israel. And in Pennsylvania, 34% of respondents said they would be more likely to vote for her if she did that. Only 7% said they would not be more willing to vote for her, and yet she refused to. In Arizona, 35% of people said they would be more likely to vote for her if she vowed to stop sending weapons to Israel. In Georgia, 39% said they would be more likely to vote for her. only 5% said they would be less likely to vote for her. So quite literally, the Democrats were going against their own voters because they wanted to continue supporting Israel and this horrific war, because for the Democratic Party leadership, the U.S. empire is more important than the people of the U.S. They care more about waging wars around the world and maintaining the hegemony of the U.S. empire with its 800 foreign military bases. They care more about maintaining U.S. control over West Asia, over the Middle East, over its strategic resources, its oil and gas. They care more about fueling the war in Ukraine and sending tens of billions of dollars of weapons to wage a proxy war against Russia. They care more about the empire than their own voters. So when you do that, when you spit in the face of your voters, they don't turn out, and Democratic turnout in the 2024 election was low, and you lose. Simple. It's very easy to explain. Now, some people would respond to this argument by claiming that U.S. voters all just moved far to the right in the 2024 race, and Kamala Harris had to continue moving to the right because that's where the voters were. But look at a state like Michigan. Donald Trump won Michigan, but meanwhile, some of the most left-wing members of Congress won races in Michigan in a landslide. For instance, the Palestinian-American leftist Democratic member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, won in a huge landslide with 70% of the vote. And Tlaib had refused to endorse Kamala Harris in protest of Kamala Harris's staunch support for Israel. So Donald Trump won Michigan, but one of the most left-wing members of Congress won Michigan in a landslide. So it's not that all voters in Michigan suddenly decided to become all far-right Trump supporters. The reality is that Kamala Harris was extremely unpopular, and voters punished her for that. Another example was Ilhan Omar. Omar is also a very left-wing member of the Democratic Party, and she's against war. She has criticized Israel and its horrific U.S.-backed war in Gaza and Lebanon, and she won in an even bigger landslide in Minnesota. A pro-Israel Republican was running against her. The pro-Israel Republican only got 25% of the vote. Ilhan Omar got 75%. It wasn't even a real competition. Because when you actually give your voters what they want, you win the election. I know that's a shocker. It's a surprise. But the Democratic Party leadership doesn't care because it's funded by big billionaire oligarchs and big corporations, and they insist on this failed strategy of trying to win over moderate Republicans. But that's not how reality works. The reality is that 94% of registered Republicans voted for Donald Trump in the 2024 election and in the 2020 election. Only 5% of registered Republicans voted Democrat in the 2024 election. This idea of the anti-Trump Republican or the moderate Republican who will vote for Kamala Harris, they barely exist. They're a tiny, tiny minority of neoconservatives like Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney, and the media loves them, but they do not represent the vast majority of voters. Now, if you looked at the polls over months, consistently, voters said that one of the most important issues for them was the economy, the bad state of the economy, and 67% of voters said the economy was not good or was poor. But some mainstream reporters like the Washington Post's Jeff Stein, they were surprised by this because they said, look, the economy is doing so well. Stocks are booming. Inflation has fallen. GDP is growing. They could not explain why there's so much voter dissatisfaction. But the answer is obvious. It's because average people, working people, have not benefited from the economic growth in the US, which has been largely concentrated in the financial sector, and the benefits of growth have gone to rich elites. Just 10% of rich Americans hold 93% of all stocks, the highest level ever recorded. The bottom 50% of Americans hold just 1% of stocks. They don't care. The bottom 50% of the country doesn't care that the S&P 500 is skyrocketing, that the Nasdaq is skyrocketing, because they're not actually benefiting from that. A small handful of rich elites are benefiting, but of course, those rich elites fund politicians and the political campaigns of both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Of course, Trump doesn't actually have solutions to these problems, but he's not the incumbent. Kamala Harris is the vice president. She is the face of the economic problems that people are facing. The Financial Times published a really good article that explains that the U.S. economic boom is a mirage. It's lopsided. Brittle quality helps explains why so many Americans will cast votes in anger. The author Ruchir Sharma noted that, quote, U.S. growth is a mirage for most Americans, driven by rising wealth and discretionary spending among the richest consumers, and distorted by growing profits for the biggest corporations. Times look good, but this growth is lopsided, brittle, and heavily dependent on spending and borrowing by the government. He continued, quote, although the world marvels at unsinkable U.S. consumers, a growing number are priced out of homes and falling behind on credit card debt. The bottom 40% by income account for 20% of all spending, while the richest 20% account for 40% of spending. That is the widest gap on record, and it is likely to widen further. Most Americans now spend so much on essentials, such as food, that they have little left for extras like travel or eating out, end quote. This is a key statistic. 40% of spending is carried out by 20% of the richest population. 20% of spending is carried out by 40% of the population. Of course, that's just spending. If you look at the inequality in household wealth, it is incredible how unequal the U.S. is. 0.1% of the population has 14% of wealth. The top 5% of the population have over 30% of wealth. The top 10% of the population have 67% of wealth. The bottom 50% has just 2.6% of wealth. That is, the richest half of the U.S. population has 97.4% of the wealth. So the vast majority of the population doesn't care if GDP growth is high when they don't actually see the benefits of that GDP growth. And they certainly don't care that the stock market is booming when they're not seeing the benefits of the growth in the stock market. The sad reality is that poverty has continued to increase, including under Biden and Harris. There was a decrease in poverty during the pandemic, ironically, because the government was providing many social programs to support people. But since 2021, poverty has increased by 67%. And you could say that, okay, the pandemic was an outlier, but even if you remove the pandemic and you go back to 2019, poverty has continued increasing. 42.8 million people in the US live under the poverty line. Food insecurity has also increased 40% since 2021. And if you remove the pandemic from the data, which is an outlier, you can still see that food insecurity has been steadily increasing, especially with the very high rates of inflation. For a lot of households, especially poor and working class people, food has become prohibitively expensive. And when food is too expensive, why would people vote for you? Now, you can say that Donald Trump has no solution to these problems. I agree with you. Donald Trump is a fraud. He's a billionaire oligarch. When he was president, he continued cutting taxes on the rich. He was funded by billionaires. He will continue cutting taxes on the rich. But the reality is that Donald Trump had a consistent message. He was offering something. The Democrats did not offer anything. Donald Trump had his scapegoats. He blamed immigrants. He blamed foreign countries. In a speech in September, Trump even told people he promised that he was going to take jobs from other countries.
But with the vision I'm outlining today, not only will we stop our businesses from leaving for foreign lands, but under my leadership, we are going to take other countries' jobs. Did you ever hear that expression before? Have you ever heard? That we're going to take other countries' jobs? It's never been stated before. We're going to take their factories, and we had it really rocking 4 years ago. We're going to bring thousands and thousands of businesses and trillions of dollars in wealth back to the good old USA. That's what we're going to be doing it, and doing it fast. And under my plan, American workers will no longer be worried about losing your jobs to foreign nations. Instead, foreign nations will be worried about losing their jobs to America. Going to bring them back.
Now, obviously, it's very unlikely that Trump will actually be able to do that. He's made a lot of false promises. He said, I'm going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. Mexico did not pay for it. So this is not the first time that Trump has made a false promise. He's the master at doing that. But despite that, the reality is that he's making a tangible offer to people. He's saying, I'm going to give you this. And he's recognizing that there is a lot of anger about deindustrialization and globalization. Since the rise of neoliberalism and free market fundamentalism in the 1970s, the US has significantly deindustrialized, losing a lot of good unionized jobs, factory jobs in the Rust Belt, in areas of the country that ended up voting for Donald Trump because he claimed that he would bring back their jobs. Now, obviously, Trump is full of BS, but he's recognizing that there's this anger and he's tapping into it, whereas the Democrats were not offering anything. Their whole message was, we're not Donald Trump. We're going to unite with the Bush-era neocons and Dick Cheney, and we're not going to change anything because everything's fine. And again, as we saw in Brexit in the UK, when the option is between the status quo and change, people often vote for change, even if the people pretending that they're going to bring change are lying, these frauds like Donald Trump. It's clear that people in the US are facing economic issues, and Trump, like many far-right leaders, he scapegoats certain groups of people, like immigrants. And Trump has made very extreme promises, threatening to deport more than 10 million undocumented immigrants in the US, even using the National Guard in this kind of authoritarian, militarized crackdown. So this obviously is an example of him scapegoating immigrants and saying, your economic problems are not caused by the same billionaire oligarchs who are funding me and who are funding the Democrats. No. It's not Wall Street's fault. It's not because deindustrialization was caused by these neoliberal free market fundamentalist economic policies. No, it's because of immigrants. This could ironically create a lot of economic problems in the US because a lot of immigrants work very low-paid menial jobs, but that are very important for the economy. Growing food, working on farms, for instance, which could not be more important, is providing food for people, or working in slaughterhouses, for instance. There are a lot of immigrants who work there, and it's going to be difficult to find people who are willing to work these dangerous and low-paid jobs. But this also could benefit some of the capitalist oligarchs who are funding Donald Trump, because as he threatens to crack down further on immigrants, it's going to mean that immigrants have fewer and fewer protections. So it makes it easier for companies and oligarchs to exploit immigrants. It makes it easier for capitalists to pay them lower and lower wages, or even to steal their wages, which is a common problem, because if you're an undocumented immigrant and you work for someone below the table and they don't pay you, they steal your wage, what are you going to do? You can't go to the police and ask for the police to take action because you don't have papers, you're not documented. So some of these capitalist interests, of course, could benefit from Trump's anti-immigrant policies, but overall, it's likely going to cause even more economic problems. But again, this is an example of how, despite Trump's so-called populist rhetoric, and despite the fact that there are some working class people who voted for him, especially in the kind of Rust Belt areas, the reality is that they're probably going to be hurt by Trump. An analysis of Donald Trump's tax proposal by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy found that Donald Trump will end up reducing taxes on the richest 5% of the country and increasing taxes on everyone else. And taxes will go up the most on the poorest 20% of working class Americans. This is just what's so tragic about this whole situation. History repeats itself. First time as tragedy, second time as farce. Because in 2016, Trump had the same message, and what did he do? He came into office and immediately he cut taxes on the rich, he cut taxes on big corporations, and for the first time, billionaires under Trump were paying a lower tax rate than the working class. In 2018, the richest 400 families in the US paid an average effective tax rate of 23%, whereas the bottom half of American households paid a tax rate of 24%, more than billionaires. And as Trump was campaigning in 2024, he held these huge galas, these fundraisers where he made millions of dollars for his campaign. And he told a bunch of billionaire oligarchs, he said, I'm going to continue cutting your taxes. So it would have been so easy to challenge Donald Trump's claim that he's a populist, supposedly, that he's going to help the working class. It's obvious that he's not going to. He did not help the working class when he was in office the first time. But the Democratic Party refused to go anywhere near that. They ran to the right of Joe Biden, and they allowed Donald Trump to portray himself falsely as an economic populist. And he won over many of those voters who previously had voted. These are people who had voted for Obama when Obama made similar promises that were also false. These were people who were very sympathetic to Bernie Sanders, who again, in 2017, was the most popular politician in the US. But the donor class of the Democratic Party did not want to go anywhere near that messaging because, of course, if the Democrats came into office and actually implemented these policies, it would hurt the billionaires and corporations who fund the Democrats. Donald Trump can use that rhetoric because, of course, billionaires supporting Trump know that he's not actually going to help workers. He's going to help the billionaires. This is why billionaires like Elon Musk were campaigning with Donald Trump because, of course, Musk knows that Trump is now going to reward Musk by cutting taxes, by providing more subsidies for Tesla and other companies. Musk is going to make a lot of money. This was an investment for him. And this is also why Donald Trump's campaign was funded by billionaire oligarchs like Steven Schwarzman, the CEO of Blackstone, the world's largest alternative asset manager and a big private equity fund on Wall Street. Schwarzman is the highest paid CEO on Wall Street, and yet he funded Donald Trump's campaign in 2020 and again in 2024 because he knows that Trump is going to help billionaires like him. Wall Street is very excited about Donald Trump. That's why when he won the election, the S&P 500 rose very rapidly because the rich know they're going to get much richer. But the irony above all is that one of the key reasons that Kamala Harris lost the 2024 election is because of very high rates of inflation that hurt her because food prices are very high. The price of everything is very high. But the reality is that Donald Trump is likely going to bring back even more inflation. A study by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget analyzed the fiscal impact of proposals by both Trump and Harris. They calculated that Donald Trump will likely contribute $7.75 trillion to national debt in the next decade because Trump is pledging to both massively expand government spending while also significantly cutting taxes on the rich, which of course also means reducing government revenue. By contrast, they estimated that Kamala Harris's proposals would have increased the government debt by about $4 trillion. So Trump is projected to increase the national debt by twice as much as Kamala would have done. A separate analysis by the Penn Wharton Business School of the University of Pennsylvania estimated that Donald Trump's tax cuts on the rich and other proposals will increase U.S. government deficits by $5.8 trillion, nearly $6 trillion over the next decade. So we're likely going to be entering another period with high rates of inflation. Now, of course, the U.S. government can pay off that debt because the U.S. government's debt is in dollars and the U.S. can print dollars. But of course, that means there will be more inflation. So that's the trade-off. If you want to manage the debt, which you can do, as modern monetary theorists point out, you can do so, but it will lead to more inflation. And we've already seen how destabilizing inflation has been on the U.S. economy and on the world. So unless the government actually has policies that help working people as they see their purchasing power erode due to inflation, in reality, what more inflation will do is lead to the rich getting even richer, because it's very likely that we will see high rates of nominal GDP growth under Trump. The economy will run hot, but then inflation will also be hot. And that means that the stock market is likely to continue to boom, especially as taxes are cut on the rich. So the S&P 500 will go up more and more. And we already see that 93% of stocks are held by 10% of the population. So that already horrific wealth inequality in the US is likely to continue getting even worse under Trump. Investors are already expecting higher inflation. This is why the yield on the US 10-year Treasury security steeply rose when Donald Trump won the election. This is a sign that they expect that there will be higher rates of inflation and that the economy will be running hot. So the Federal Reserve will go back to raising interest rates, which will lead to higher yields on Treasury securities. And this isn't even to mention the impact of tariffs. Donald Trump has pledged very high tariffs on multiple countries, including blanket 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, which will likely lead to even more inflation because the US imports so many products from China, and those will be more expensive because of the tariffs. I'm going to talk about the impact of Donald Trump's policies on China and many other countries in a separate video, but today I wanted to focus specifically on why Kamala Harris lost the election, and I didn't want to make this video too long. So definitely check back for my video explaining the impact of Donald Trump's victory on US foreign policy and the rest of the world. But on that note, I'm going to conclude. I hope I helped people to understand a little bit of what's going on in US politics, why Donald Trump is coming back to the White House, and why the Democrats have yet again failed like they did in 2016, why they have not learned lessons because the political party itself, the Democratic structure, is entirely dependent on billionaire oligarchs, the donor class, that refuse to learn lessons because it goes against their economic interests. And of course, why Donald Trump was able to use kind of populist rhetoric that tapped into anger at the current economic problems, but how he's not going to actually solve those economic problems. Likely they will continue to get worse. Inequality will get worse. And unfortunately, he will probably respond with even more scapegoating of foreign countries, scapegoating of China, scapegoating of immigrants. It's going to be 4 very difficult years. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. And I will see you all next time.